Michael Brenner from Google is here, a collaborator of ours that we are very proud of, to talk about some things that I don't even know about. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. So does my mic work?
It
Can you
does.
hear me? It works? Okay, so I guess I want to start by thanking all of you and thanking ALS TDI on behalf of the group of people from Google who's here. We've been working with ALS TDI for the last couple of years. I don't remember. And it's been, I've been sort of doing research projects. I'll just say this for me, although you can ask the others. I've been doing research projects for probably the last 20 or 25 years, and this is by far the most rewarding thing that I've ever been involved in, and it's really because of all of you. So, okay, so I'm gonna, so there's a sort of famous saying. Actually, this now seems a little bit too loud. So there's a famous saying, which is that thinking about technology, we always underestimate the change that will occur, or we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And a good example of this are these photographs of comparing the inauguration of Pope Benedict to that of Pope Francis. So in Pope Benedict, so they are only 8 years apart, but whereas when Pope Benedict was inaugurated, everyone watched the festivities with their own eyes, when Pope Francis was inaugurated, it all was through the lens of their cell phones. So as big of an advance this is, there's been what many people feel is an even bigger advance in terms of its impact on human lives, which is artificial intelligence, which over the last 5 years has really gone through a revolution that has consequences for all aspects of our lives. And what I will get to as I go through this presentation is first I'm going to give you an introduction to this, and then we're going to get to the ways we've been trying to use this to help people with ALS. So what is artificial intelligence? So of course you all know what intelligence is. We look at the world and we're somehow able to interpret it. You're all sitting there and you're looking at me and I raise my arms up and you notice look, he's raising his arms up. And that's because you've learned what it means for people to raise their arms up and there's sort of, if you imagine trying to train a computer to do the task that you do every day, there are sort of two paradigms that you could imagine. One paradigm is called rule-based. So you could imagine saying, oh, there's a person in front of me, and when he starts to look like a T, he's raised both of his arms up, right? So that's one way of doing it. And sort of a Google, sort of an example that you might imagine that an internet company would work on is spam filtering of email. One way to write a spam filter is to make a list of all the words that would occur in a spam email and then just look for them in the email. So for example, some weird spelling of Viagra. But there's a totally different way of doing this, which is that instead of learning the rules, teaching the rules one by one, what you could do if you wanted to build a spam filter is give the computer lots of examples of emails that people have marked as spam and tell the computer to please learn by itself whatever pattern it can find that makes people call something spam. So this is an idea that's been around for a long time, but in recent years it's really come into its own. And I want to sort of show you how that works. So there's a technology, or sort of a type of computer program, you could say, that's come about, which is called a neural network. And it's a computer program which is built in such a way as to be inspired by the brain, which is why we call it a neural network. It may or may not have anything to do with the brain, but anyway, it was inspired by the brain. And the way that it works is that suppose you wanted to design a computer program to tell the difference between cats and dogs. What you do is you give the computer large numbers of examples of cats and large numbers of examples of dogs. And you give the computer a picture of a cat, and then you say, what do you think this is? And it says it's a dog, and you say, no, you're wrong, it's a cat. And the way that you tell it that is you adjust the parameters in the computer program until, oh, I see, it's a cat. And then you keep giving it more pictures, one of a cat and one of a dog, and it keeps adjusting the parameters. And eventually, when you've gone through, I don't know, 20,000, 50,000 examples of cats and dogs, then you think, okay, the thing now knows what a cat is and what a dog is. So then you have to test it. And the way you test it is you take another set of data, which we call test data, which are pictures of cats and dogs that the computer has never seen, and you give it to the computer and say, is it a cat or a dog? And you then see whether it's learned well. And so it happens, this seems like sort of a silly thing, but it happens that in the last 5 years, say, computer programs have gotten much, much better at this task to the extent that they now basically match and in many cases, as I'll show you, exceed human performance at a task like this. Now, of course, identifying cats is not the most useful task. I mean, it's sort of cute. You can see lots of cats. You might be interested in distinguishing cats from bunnies. That's a slightly different task. This is a task that humans do very well, but if you think about what it would take to design a computer program to do that, I mean, the silly way, if you had asked me 5 years ago, what I would have said is, well, what you should do is you should look for ears that look like triangles in the pictures, and if you find a triangle ear, it's a cat, and if you find a long floppy ear, it's a dog. I mean, a bunny, sorry. A bunny. If it's a long floppy ear, it's a bunny. So but now actually the computer learns the rules itself. So one interesting thing is that we as humans don't necessarily know the rules. So blueberry muffins from dogs, this is a little harder. You can all see which are blueberry muffins and which are dogs, but you can imagine that teaching a computer to do this well is hard. So at Google, this is part of the product line. This is very practical. This is an example of a Google product. So basically what it does is it takes a picture of a sign in one language and it converts it to another language. So notice what you have to be able to do this well. You have to, first of all, figure out which part of the picture are letters. That's not so easy. You have to deduce the font of the letters. You have to basically figure out how to translate the word in one language to the other language that you're doing it. So there's any number of tasks that are like the cat-dog task that are embedded in this device. So here's another one, which I think is also interesting, so here's an email, and I don't know if you've noticed, if any of you use Gmail, at the bottom it gives you possible answers. So that's actually, it's pretty incredible. I mean, it's getting better. What's even better than this, actually, is there's a technology which is called Smart Compose that's sort of just come out, where you start typing, and it finishes the sentence for you. So this actually is starting to become useful, right? And it does this by looking at lots of emails and saying, gee, haven't seen you in a while. And it just comes out. And so now we're getting to the point where it actually might be useful. So actually my sort of intellectually favorite example, although I don't know what this is good for, but I just have to tell it to you. A group designed a computer program which did the following thing. It took 3 games, chess, Japanese chess, and Go. And they basically built it, so it's a group at DeepMind. They built the computer program. They told it to play against itself. So initially it was told to make random moves. And so it played against itself. And by playing against itself, it was able to become the best player in the world at all 3 games, including beating all other computer programs. Within 3 days, it was the best chess player in the world. It discovered all the chess books, basically, because it just learned that if you do this better, just from learning from data, that you could do better. And it's really quite, and I think we're only starting to wrap our minds around what this means for technology. So now before I get to how artificial intelligence can be applied to ALS, which at least for us is a rather new thing, I want to just give you an example or two of how at Google AI has been applied to healthcare, just so that you can start to see how these ideas really generalize to become practical. So diabetic retinopathy is a growing cause of blindness, and the way that it's diagnosed is that you go to the eye doctor and they take fundus pictures of your eyes. So these are 2 fundus pictures of the eyes of 2 different people, and the eye doctor, the ophthalmologist, looks at it and characterizes what the severity of the eye disease is. So from blue means that you don't have any disease to red is the most severe. So if you go and bring fundus images to a doctor, then you might wonder how accurate they are. So one way to determine how accurate a doctor is to give it to 10 doctors and to compare the different doctors to each other. So this is a chart where the columns are doctors and the rows are people, are their fundus images. And the colors are the score. And what you'll notice is that the doctors can be quite inconsistent. So for example, these poor people here and here have doctors that are saying that they're all the way from having no macular disease to having severe macular disease. So this is an example of a task which is very much like the cat task. It's like, here's a picture, tell me what the score is. And this is something that you can, in principle, train a computer to do. And we do this in the same way that the cat thing works. You feed the computer pictures of, first you get panels of doctors to score, right, so that you sort of know what the labels are. And you feed the images to the machine, to the neural network, and you get it to predict the output. And it turns out that this works extremely well. So there's too much on this slide, but let me just sort of summarize it in this way. When this work was published, which was a couple of years ago, the computer program was as good as a panel of ophthalmologists, not a single ophthalmologist. It was as good as an entire panel. Now the computer program is as good as a panel of retinal specialists. So single computer program, you give it the thing, it will give you an outcome which is as good as that. And it's even gotten to the point that I understand there's a paper that's sort of being written in press that takes the rules that were learned from the computer program to try to rewrite the manual of how you diagnose the disease. So this is getting to the point where computers are really helping healthcare in a significant way. So the other thing which is interesting about this is that, remember, we started out with cats and dogs, so now we have fundus images. So fundus images, of course, one thing you can do with the fundus images to try to predict the level of eye disease that you might have. But of course, every image comes with it an entire person who has an entire history. And so it turns out that from this single image, it's possible to predict the person's age, which in a couple of years. It's possible to predict whether or not they're a smoker or not with high probability. It's possible to predict their blood pressure, their cardiovascular risk. And really, to everyone's great shock, this is sort of an irrelevant fact, but it's an interesting one. With something like 99% confidence, you can predict someone's gender from just looking at the picture of the eye. The reason that that's not interesting, the reason that that's sort of not useful is because, well, we know how to predict people's gender. The reason that it is interesting because no one knew there was a signature in the fundus picture of the eye. And if you use your imagination, then you might imagine how this could have consequences in other parts of healthcare. So, okay, so now I want to move to how these types of ideas can be applied to ALS. And this is work we've been doing in collaboration with Fernando and Steve and all of the people at ALS TDI, and thus all of you for the last period of time. So, okay, I'm an applied mathematician, so I should admit. So I don't know anything. But I think the precision medicine program is amazing. The data collection that it has. And with that amount of data, if one analyzes it in a clever way, then it really is a powerful paradigm to more accurately diagnose and in principle, manage ALS. So what could you do with this data? So you could better stratify people. You could sort of understand if there are different types of disease trajectories and what are their causes. You could conduct clinical trials with more precision. I'm parroting Steve and Fernando here. You could conduct clinical trials with more precision because you might be able to say that different types of people are different, and maybe drugs that would help one type of person won't help another, would be better for another. But in order to know that, you need to be able to characterize who is in what bucket early on. So artificial intelligence, as I've shown you, offers the possibility of taking data and to use it to make predictions of exactly this type. What we have to discover to use it is just how. It's not as simple as cats and dogs, but nonetheless, there must be a way to do it, and that's what we've been trying to address. So, the sort of simplest thing you can imagine doing, which isn't necessarily the most important, but it is the simplest, is to predict FRS scores. So the precision medicine program collects, among other things, as you all know very well, waveforms. So both voice and accelerometer signals. So the voice signals, you all know better than I, are repetitions of the phrase, "I owe you a yo-yo today 5 times." So this is what the red curve is, what the waveform of part of such a repetition looks like. It's just a waveform. So and then there's also measurements of accelerometer data. So this is an example of a trace of an accelerometer during an exercise. And of course, there's tons of data like this. And the question is can you go from these waveforms, from these pictures, they look like pictures, to predict and understand different FRS scores in a sort of more, in a different way. And I want to just spend a moment talking about that. So if you could, then it could be quite useful in ways that we might not even be able to imagine right now. So, okay. So this is the waveform. This is sort of terrible, but this is a mathematician's view of the phrase, "I owe you a yo-yo today," repeated 5 times. So it's just a waveform. And so what you're supposed to do is to look at that and tell me the FRS score of the person, the FRS speech score of the person who has that waveform. Does anybody know? If I played it for you, you would know, but you're not allowed to do that because now you're using your brain, and that's what we're trying to emulate in the computer. So it turns out that's 2. Okay, so then there's this one. So that's 4. So they look pretty similar. Okay, so now here's the game you're supposed to play. I show you this one. What's the FRS score of this? And of course, none of us know. So, okay, so I want to tell you how you use AI to address this problem. So I've already told you, so I have a principle of life that I think is just generally useful, which is that whenever you have a hard problem, turn it into an easy problem. It's the only hope you have. And I already told you there's basically one thing that we can do. We can distinguish cats from dogs. Remember, I told you we can distinguish cats from dogs. Now, cats and dogs are images. They're not waveforms. So we need to turn this into a waveform. So we're really good at images. So we have to somehow, no, sorry, we have to turn the waveform into an image. That's what we have to do. So OK, how do you turn a waveform into an image? So this is how you do it. You take the waveform and you break it up into little bits. These are little bits which are about a second long. They're long enough to sort of involve many phonemes, if you want to think about it from the point of view of speech. Then what you do is for each one of these little bits, you plot what we call a spectrogram of the signal. So what that means is that instead of plotting the amplitude of the sound, you plot time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. So this is the frequency spectrum. And then you do that for each little bit of the waveform. And then you smush them all together. And now we have an image. Now, it's not an image that's readily interpretable because you don't process, well, you may process sound this way. You don't know. That's a question of how our ears work. You don't know how you, I don't know how you process sound. But it may be that we process sound through images like this. So now we've turned it into an image problem. We have two different images. This is the two that I showed you before, FRS2, FRS4. And so what we did was to simply take our wonderful neural network that distinguishes cats from dogs. We fed it in images from the precision medicine program with different FRS scores. And we tried to see if it was able to predict FRS score. And the sort of short answer is that it can. So this is, I'm going to show you the FRS trajectories. These are the speech scores for several different people in the precision medicine program. So on these plots, the green dots are the reported FRS scores, and the blue dots are the predicted ones. And also, I should tell you, remember I told you the way that's to know that you have a computer program to learn something is you give it lots of data, and then you hold data back that it's never seen, and you ask it how it does on data that's held back. And that's what this is. So the computer has never seen this person before we gave it to them. And you see that the blue curve sort of nicely interpolates between the green dots and sort of predicts the transition from FRS 3 to 2 in a much more continuous and fashion. So here's another person. You see the blue dots are the predictions, and the green dots are the reported FRS scores. So here's another person. And so on. And so this seems to work. So that's one thing. So of course, accelerometers are also waveforms. If you move your arm up and down in an exercise, then it results in a signal that looks something like this. That means that what I just told you also applies to accelerometer data as well. So this is a picture that corresponds to that. And so we basically just played the same game. We fed in, and this, by the way, the slides I'm about to show you are 2 days old, no, 1 day old. There's a principle that is, we've been working on this furiously to get ready for this meeting. So the thing about this is what I'm about to show you is very promising, but it should at least be a week old before you start to believe it. I don't know. But anyway, so we fed it. So we fed it. We did the same thing, though. We fed it lots of pictures of these accelerometer spectrograms. Of course, there are 4 limbs, and there are different exercises, as you all know. And we then tried to predict many of the different FRS scores that correspond to limb motion. And again, this works pretty well. So I'm going to show you a bunch of curves of different FRS scores from a single participant. So this is climbing stairs FRS score as a function of time. The blue, again, is what the computer thinks, and the green are the reported values. This is handwriting FRS scores as a function of time. The green is what was reported. The blue is what the computer thinks. And this is respiratory insufficiency as a function of time. You'll notice this looks like a very large error bar, but you should notice the scale on the axis. This goes from 3.4 to 4. So basically, the computer thinks that there's no effect, and indeed there's not. And here's the walking FRS score as a function of time. So this gives a way to interpret this data. And what I think is very nice about this and is very promising is that these are completely unbiased methods for assessment. I mean, in principle, you could imagine doing a bunch of exercises or saying, I owe you a yo-yo today, and giving it to the computer, and the computer would automatically tell you, there's no reason you should wait. This is what we think your FRS score is today. And that seems useful, but it would be nice to be even more ambitious than that. And this is, again, I'm parroting Steve and Fernando and our friends at ALS TDI, which is that what one would really like to do is to combine all of the data from the precision medicine program, voice accelerometer, genetic data, everything you can think of, to try to stratify populations for drug trials, to sort of understand what the different trajectories of the course of the disease are in such a way that one might be able, and this is all just rampant speculation. I don't know if this is possible, but without tools like this, it's sort of hard to know how you would even ask to basically to sort of take some data at early times and then to predict what's going to happen at later times. And there are really lots of questions that one can ask with these sorts of techniques. So okay, I want to just change. I have like, I don't know if I've talked too long or too short. I never have any idea. But I just want to end with sort of one other way that artificial intelligence might be useful for people with ALS. So when Fernando and Steve gave us the data to try to predict speech FRS scores, our first reaction was actually not to use a neural network, even though the first reaction of how you're going to do it is to simply give the data to a speech recognizer. I mean, and just to find out, so the question was, I mean, you can give, I owe you a yo-yo today to a speech recognizer, and you can ask, well, did it recognize it? So we know, so if you say I owe you a yo-yo today 5 times, then the speech recognizer should recognize I owe 5 times, you 5 times, yo-yo 5 times, and today 5 times. And indeed, for a person with FRS4, that's roughly what you see. There's some error, but I don't think that this error is significant. And you notice, and this is something that you all know very well, is that as the FRS score degrades, then as it goes down, the speech recognizer stops working. And I mean, you can see it sort of painfully in the data. So Google, as you all know, is an internet company. I mean, and really, I mean, if you're working at Google, Google products should work for everybody. I mean, you know, if you have a French accent and speak English, the speech recognizer should work for you. And if you have ALS, the speech recognizer should work for you too. I mean, that's sort of a fairness issue in a way. And the fact that it doesn't is basically because the speech recognizers have never seen voice samples from people with ALS. So we decided to look into this a little bit, and I just want to tell you about some preliminary experiments in that goal. I mean, our goal is to basically explore whether or not Google products, and it's basically everything, use speech as an input method. I mean, Google Home, Google Translate, search, everything uses speech as an input method. If you want to search, you can talk to it. You don't have to type, right? But you can only talk to it if it understands what you say. Is we want to see if we can figure out whether or not that can really work better for all users. And so, so let me just tell you a little bit about speech recognizers. So actually, all I have to tell you is that I've already told you about speech recognizers. Because the way that speech recognizers work, and this is a simplification, but it's not a dramatic simplification, is they take an input, which is just like, so you say, I owe you a yo-yo today. You take an input, you make it into a picture, because remember, I told you we could only deal with pictures. You give it to a neural network, and instead of telling you to predict the FRS score of the person, you instead tell it to predict what the person says. That's essentially how a speech I mean, it's an oversimplification, but it's not. The people from Google can yell at me if they want. It's not wrong. So that's what it's supposed to do. And so okay. So we, working with our friends at ALS TDI, we sort of carried out a small pilot project with participants, a small number of participants in the precision medicine program to sort of test this out. And I should say, actually, probably explicitly, that this was a blinded study. That is, we don't know who the people who did what I'm about to show you are, and nor should we ever, because it was a blinded experiment. But what we did with our friends at ALS TDI is to come up with a set of phrases that a person with ALS might most often say, because we wanted to set a task for ourselves just to see how well one could do. And so we have a list of 1,000 phrases. Some of them come from voice banks, right? But they were basically voice bank phrases that were modified by Maeve and Fernando. And then what we did was we basically went and got the tools that Google has used over the years to train speech recognizers. I mean, so the way that Google does this in general is to collect lots of data from people and to record it and then to basically make the speech recognizer work. That's why, right, the speech recognizer will work for me and it will work for somebody with a British accent with FRS4, because it's seen lots of us, and it's the same recognizer. And so we just asked ourselves the question, if we use what is literally the current state-of-the-art speech recognizer, we got people to record phrases, how well the recognizer could do. And although this is all very preliminary, I just want to show you one example of what was possible with really not a lot of data. This is formatted badly, so I have to explain to you what this is. And also, the colors aren't showing up. So so I have to explain to you what this is. So on the right side are the transcripts. So will you prepare dinner? On the left side is what the speech recognizer recognized. So will you prepare dinner? Will you prepare dinner? I had a great time. I had a great time. And if you look through this, so on my computer, what you can see are little pink bars on the errors. And there are some errors. There aren't very many. Let me show you an error. Here, I need to find. Oh, I need the urinal. I need the fural. I don't know what fural is, but for some reason it said fural. There's another here. I'll show you one more error. But I think what's really exciting about this, at least in principle, oh, here's one. I need to sleep. It recognized I need to speak, which is a completely reasonable mistake. So, but for the most part, with some training, the speech recognizer, it was possible to make it work very well. And so we don't know how far this goes. It's early days, but we sort of feel at Google that it's our job to try to make these things work for all people. And so that's, I guess, what I'm here to report to you today. What I've shown you today, the work that I've shown you today was really the work of a huge team of people. So this is the sub-team of people at Google on the left who has basically worked on the speech recognizers, the FRS score detection. There's really a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about working on this and trying to figure out if we can do something that would help. And this, of course, is the team at ALS TDI without whom nothing would have happened. And the thing I want to leave you with today is that if any of you or your family members or your friends are interested in this, we're now opening this up. And there's a link that's sort of at the bottom, which you can write down, but that there are people around from Google who have computers and things that you could do this. If you sign up and give us your name, then we can do these experiments for you or anyone too, and try to build speech recognizers that work. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you. Steve should have the first question. Oh,
Description, so thank you so much.
No,
You shouldn't be afraid. I think, from my perception, one day in Google time is probably a month in real time. So it was really great that you shared stuff that's literally coming off the presses. Can you explain to us a little bit about how this artificial intelligence could work without training? So you gave examples where you can feed the algorithm pictures of cats and dogs, and it gets good at distinguishing. You can feed it voice recordings, and it can figure it out. But in the example of the next thing that you might want from our program and from people in our community, could an algorithm like that help us distinguish morphological differences in neurons growing on a dish from different people, even though we don't know what they are?
So someone from Google might want to correct what I'm about to say, in particular Philip, who's somewhere in the room, but I will try this, which is that, I mean, you need to give it some day. So sure, but it requires experience to learn, right? If you just imagine yourself as a young child learning to interact with the world, it does require experience. So you could imagine giving the computer pictures of cell shapes together with other data. I mean, pick your cell type and getting it to learn patterns and then recapitulating them in other situations. I'm not sure if that's what you're thinking, but without telling it anything, there's no way it can know. You have to give it something. What you don't have to tell it, and this is the magical thing that I guess just speaking for myself, I never imagined that this would be so important, that you don't have to tell it how to make the cells correspond to the speech. Like, it's crazy to make, oh, here are the cells, whatever you want to measure, right? And here's the speech. Can you please tell me the mapping of one to the other? That's crazy. How are we going to make rules from that? Because the cells are growing somewhere in my body, and the speech is coming out of my mouth. But this will allow you to make that transformation, but you do have to give it the information. You can't invent things from nothing. Does that answer?
So I see I'm going to get an answer from the person that could.
Yeah.
If you don't have labels, one thing that you can do is to say whether things are definitively different or not. So you can put them into groups or clusters. So for example, we have a project right now, a cell project in cancer, that is looking at the mechanism of action of drugs. And we're actually using systems that are trained on consumer data, the same things that look at cats and dogs. And the trick is we look at sort of the controls. There's a lot of visual variation in the controls, and we have to learn what's uninteresting. And then as you put the drugs on the cells, they sort of change in particular ways. And then what we can say is, did something interesting happen, and which ones are more or less alike? And we have a paper coming out on this. It's actually sort of fairly spectacular results about telling not just the mechanism of action of drugs, but like we'll see, for example, 3 drugs that have the same mechanism of action. They all cluster right next to each other, but in 3 very distinct subclusters because of the secondary effects. And we start to see the effects of the drugs at super low doses long before any other detection. And this is essentially an unlabeled task, but it's clustering. It's just saying which is alike and which is different. So, you know, we need to talk more. There's a lot of cell work we can do together. So.
Well, somebody with a microphone, sorry, I can't choose.
Could you speak a little bit about the pilot in terms of how many people were in the pilot with ALS TDI? The number?
I can. So it was a small number. So here, let me think about the way to.
And were they all ALS patients? Or?
All of the people that participated in this pilot were people. This is a collaboration with ALS TDI.
Yep.
That's statement 1. So I don't know who any of the people are, nor will I ever, because that was one of the ground rules. Fernando and Steve and Maeve know who the people are. Maybe what you're asking, okay, so maybe what you're asking is this. I'm trying to figure out how to answer what you're asking. So this result was trained on a single person.
Oh.
So this was, but it was not a lot. So I don't want to, it's dangerous for me to say how much data it took because I don't want to set expectations wrongly. We don't know, but this was not a lot of data from a single person. So we've been training per person speech recognition models, which is completely not the way the paradigm has gone. Of course, ultimately what we would like is to have a speech recognition model that a person would speak to it. It may recognize what FRS score you were, and then it would work for you. But there's no reason to imagine that the same, so this is completely uncharted territory, right? In fact, I should say, for those of you who don't have ALS, what you might have noticed in the last couple of years is that the speech recognizers, and this isn't just Google, this is Google, Apple, they've gotten much better. They used to be really kind of bad, they've gotten much better. So that same technology, that's what we're using. We're starting with the state of the art. This is, in fact, the model that we're training was sort of published this summer, basically, right? I mean, this is like literally the state of the art, and we've been training it on single individuals. Well, you just have to promise not to hold me to this, roughly an hour's worth of utterances. Utterances mean I give you a phrase. Actually, we have a little pilot. We've been trying to figure out how to make this more fun because it's not sitting in front of a computer recording things doesn't sound like much fun. So we've almost, we can use open source books. So, and I love Sherlock Holmes. So I was thinking like you could just read Sherlock Holmes. Mm-hmm. Right? Because at least that's, I don't know, maybe you don't like Sherlock Holmes, but I like Sherlock Holmes, right? Read a Sherlock Holmes story, we take the data, and then see how well it can do. The question is how much data is required to get a speech recognizer for a person with ALS, which has the same quality as with you or with me. That's an open question, but what we know, and I think what was promising is that you can do very well on a relevant task, namely the task that our friends at ALS TDI set, with roughly an hour of data. I can't promise that generalizes, at least on some people with FRS2.
So do we know at what stage the person was?
This person is FRS2.
Okay.
Speech score FRS2, that's what this is. So this is sufficiently dysarthric that you can, it's not, so we were very surprised you could do this well. Let me just say it this way.
Got it.
I don't want to give too much hope other than that we're working on this. That's, I guess, what I want to say.
Ron said something really important that I want to repeat is that for this program, why we would love to get more help is that we're willing to do personalized models for people, and that's new. So Google, up till now, has got these one big models that work for everybody. But in this, we're exploring doing very personalized models. So this is why contributing can be really helpful.
Well, and it's also, the other reason why contributing can be really helpful and telling friends, recording is useful. This is also a situation where it really is a collective good. So the reason that the speech recognizers work so well for people who don't have ALS is because all people, thousands of hours of recordings were pooled to make these models using what I just said. And so what we would like to do, and this is what we would like to explore, is to put lots of people together and make models that work for lots of people. But essentially, because we're being conservative, our first goal is to make things that work, right? That it's more conservative to train them per individual. It's just something that wasn't technologically possible for lots of reasons that I can tell you offline until really very recently. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you for very exciting topic. But could you look me in the eye soon and tell me if I have ALS or not? Could you diagnose with your technique of photographing the eye?
Oh, I see. That's an interesting question. Of course, I don't know the answer to that question. I guess what I would say is the following thing. All measurements don't contain all predictions, right? So, whereas it's perhaps not surprising that if you take a picture of the eye, you can tell something about someone's cardiac risk, because of course, the fundus pictures of the eyes have vessels in them. It's not that surprising that you could measure blood pressure. There are blood vessels. There must be signatures in blood vessels, right, that tell you whether or not what your cardiac risk is. For ALS, I don't know. So I'm not telling you that you can make any measurement and make any prediction. What I'm telling you is that you can take measurements that were never used for one purpose and actually make them into actual reasonable diagnostic tools. I don't know if that makes sense.
I have two questions. One was, are you making a commitment to ALS patients to do personalized speech recognition if you participate as a member of your study? In other words, you would create a model that would allow for individual translation?
That is what we're trying to do. Listen, anyone who I can just speak for myself. I personally feel, if thousands of people sign up, then I'm going to have a problem on my hand. But speaking for myself, I feel the technology has come to the age where it's reasonable to try this, and it is my duty to try this. And I think that the other people in the room from Google will tell you similar stories. It's not, if you record, right, then we have to try, and if we try, we'll figure out a way to get it to you. All of the wrinkles haven't been ironed out yet. This is very new, right? But on the other hand, in the spirit of let's bring you the technology as soon as we have it, we now have it enough that we can do things. And I guess so if anyone records, then I'm probably gonna get in trouble. I will train the model. I will do it.
Great.
And more to the point, actually, I should say Joel's sitting over there. So you see, there's a quiet person named Joel. So Joel is actually amazing. So he's the one who actually trains them. He teaches the rest of us how to train the models.
And the right. Thank you. And the other question I had was, did you try to see what the results were if you used a non-standardized phrase to see how well it translated?
Yeah. So if you use non-standardized phrases, there are more errors. So in fact, for people without ALS, if you use your speech recognizer, if you just talk to your phone, what you will notice is that it recognizes pretty much. I said last night to my phone, I was trying to make this point, and I said supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I was like, let's see what it can recognize. It basically got it, right? So that's not standard. That was almost certainly not in the training set, right? It's certainly true that with less data, that you're going to make more errors the more complicated the speech task is. And one of the things that we have to sort of wrap our heads around is what is the relationship between how much data we have and what the size of the task is. But my feeling is if we all band together and we have recordings, right, of lots of different, people with different ways of speaking, that, the history and the subject has been that with enough data, this problem can be solved generally. But we don't know how much data it takes. And if you go and ask an expert in speech recognition, then, it's not clear they know. So we're trying to answer these questions. Oh, yeah.
So your technology has the potential to improve lives of patients, but also to change the way we do clinical trials for ALS. Yeah. Are you aware of any examples where AI has entered the world of clinical trials for any indication?
Right, I'm going to defer to Philip. Philip, you should probably come up here and talk, because I'm now, gotten to the point where this is a very good question.
It's still experimental because at some level you have to get the FDA to believe these new biomarkers. So the idea is that if we can generate more precise biomarkers in whatever ways, like instead of the fairly blocky FRS scores, if we can do a more predictive number and it's more subjective, we have to then get the FDA to believe that, so they can then believe the statistics, so that you can have fewer people in the trial, or that you could measure efficacy. But we actually have quite a few different projects for different diseases saying, can we come up with biomarkers? So just as an example, there are drugs that after you have a heart attack that are supposed to minimize the chance that you'll get another one. So if we have a predictor, which we can do now from the retina as to how likely you are to get a heart attack, we're doing trials now to gather the data so that in the next round of trials we can have the provisional endpoint, so that in the round of trials after that, then it'll actually be, okay, this is sort of precise. So I can't give you an example where they're actually using it now, but we are beginning to collect lots and lots of data. Some of it is imagery, but this is why Steve's precision medicine program is so important. So it's an unfortunately long road, but we have to start somewhere. I work for Mike, so.
Okay, well, thank you all.
Any other questions? Or?